The taste of boiled leather was the taste of despair. Abel Hale gnawed on the strip of his own belt, his teeth grinding against the tough cured hide, imagining it was salted pork, imagining it was anything but what it was. The last desperate act of a starving man. His stomach, a hollow and ravenous beast, clenched in protest. Outside, the wind had been screaming for 2 weeks, a relentless, vocal fury that sounded less like weather and more like a predator circling his small, snow-entombed cabin. But the sound outside was nothing compared to the one that had started inside his own head. It was a whisper, a sibilant hiss that coiled around his thoughts, speaking his name with a hungry familiarity. Triple Abel. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't madness. It was something else, something patiently waiting for him to break. He threw the leather strip into the dying embers of the fire and watched it smolder, the acrid smoke a fitting incense for his own slow decay. The real hunger, he was beginning to understand, was not in his belly. It was in the marrow of the world itself, and it was calling him to dinner. This was not the winter he had planned. Only a month ago, the late November air in the North Woods had carried a clean, sharp blade's edge, a promise of a season that would kill the careless. But Abel Hale was not a careless man. He had run a calloused hand over the stack of prime beaver and mink pelts in the corner of his cabin, the soft fur a stark contrast to the rough-hewn logs of his world. This pile was his gospel, the physical proof of his resilience, the currency that would buy a real doctor from Duluth for Lily. Her cough had rattled in his memory for the entire 200 miles he'd trekked into this unforgiving silence. A father's duty was a simple, brutal arithmetic of survival, and Abel was a master of the calculus. He had built this cabin with his own hands, felled the timber, chinked the logs with mud and moss. It was a testament to his pragmatism, a fortress against the coming white siege. He had felt the familiar pride of self-reliance as he barred the door against the first swirling flakes of snow. The warnings he'd received at the trading post from the old Ojibwe, Makwa, had seemed a distant, feeble thing then. The elder had looked at him not with contempt, but a deep, sorrowful pity, his words a low murmur about a long winter, and spirits that walk on the wind when the hunger is deep. "Some hungers never die, Hale," the old man had said, his eyes like polished riverstones. "They only wait." Folklore. Stories to keep children from wandering too far from the fire. Abel had his own stories, written in trap lines and skinning knives, and they spoke only of the tangible world. The storm did not arrive. It descended. It was a living entity, a suffocating, malevolent force that erased the world. The snow was not a blanket, but a shroud, piling in impossible drifts that climbed the cabin walls. The wind was its voice, howling not with the mindless fury of nature, but with a strange, vocal cadence that seemed to search for a way inside. Days bled into a week, each dawn a reluctant gray smear against the single frosted window pane. The world outside had ceased to exist, replaced by a roaring, featureless white abyss. Abel's pragmatism began to fray at the edges. He rationed his salted pork and hardtack with a grim discipline, but the gnawing in his belly was a constant, cold companion. The chill of the cabin was a physical presence, a thing that seeped through the stoutest logs and settled deep in his bones. The whispers started then, faint at first, a high, thin sound like a wire vibrating in the gale. But they grew clearer, more deliberate, a thread of malice woven into the fabric of the blizzard, as if the storm was learning his name. 2 weeks passed. The blizzard, a thing that should have exhausted its fury in days, raged on with an undiminished, unnatural persistence. The cabin had become a cage. Abel's world had shrunk to the space between 4 wooden walls, the flickering firelight pushing back a sea of hungry shadows. His supplies were a cruel joke. The hunger was now a form of madness. He boiled pine needles for a bitter, foul-tasting tea that did nothing but stain his tongue green. He gnawed on his knuckles until they bled, the coppery taste a brief, shocking flare of sensation in a world that had become numb. He began to have waking nightmares. He saw Lily's face in the flames of the fire, her small frame racked by that terrible cough. The whispers seized on his love and twisted it into a tool of exquisite torture. "She is waiting, Abel. She needs you to be strong. You cannot die here." He had to get out. The thought was a primal scream in the silence of his mind. It took him the better part of a day, his movements sluggish and weak, to claw his way out. He battered the cabin door with his shoulder until the frame splintered, only to be met by a solid wall of packed snow. He dug with his bare hands, then, with a piece of kindling, a frantic animal burrowing from its trap. When he finally broke through, gasping in the frigid air, the world he emerged into was an alien planet. The familiar forest was gone, buried beneath monolithic white dunes and sculpted drifts that curled like frozen waves. The trees were skeletal, their branches laden with a weight that seemed to bend them in supplication. The silence was absolute, profound, the kind of quiet that precedes a scream. The wind, for a moment, was still, and in that stillness he saw it. Across the frozen, snow-swept lake, a figure stood against the whiteout. It was a stark, vertical slash of darkness against the blinding canvas. It was impossibly tall, unnaturally thin, its proportions all wrong. It stood perfectly still, watching him. Abel squinted, his mind refusing to process the shape. It was a trick of the light, a snow devil, as the old-timers called them, a whirlwind of snow and shadow. Before he could convince himself, it was gone, simply not there anymore, swallowed by the immense, indifferent white. But the image was burned onto the back of his eyes, a splinter of wrongness that his rational mind could not dislodge. The whispers grew more seductive, their tone shifting from torment to temptation. "There is meat in the forest, Abel. The forest always provides for those who are willing to take it. Easy meat, warm meat." He saw the gaunt figure again. It was at the edge of the tree line now, closer. He could make out details that his mind screamed to reject. Limbs that were too long, joints that bent at odd angles. It didn't move like a man or an animal. It moved like a shadow flowing from one tree to the next without a sound, a flicker at the edge of his vision. It was a violation of the natural order, a walking blasphemy against the world he knew. In a final, desperate gamble, Abel took his rifle and stumbled into the frozen labyrinth. His legs were heavy, his breath a ragged plume of white in the killing cold. He was hunting for a deer, a rabbit, a squirrel, anything to silence the ravenous beast in his gut. The forest was dead. There were no tracks, no birds, no sign that anything else lived in this white hell. The only prints in the snow were his own ragged boot marks, and, he noticed with a jolt of ice in his veins, a second set of tracks that sometimes paralleled his own. They were long and narrow, impossibly so, as if made by something walking on the edges of its feet. As the weak, gray light of dusk began to fail, the whispers became his guide. They were no longer just sounds, but a tangible pull, a current in the frozen air, drawing him towards a specific point in the woods. This way, Abel, a gift. The forest has a gift for you. He stumbled through the deep drifts, his rifle a useless weight in his numb hands, until he saw it. A strange mound of snow near the base of an ancient gnarled pine. It was not a natural drift. He began to dig, his movements frantic, a primal instinct overriding the exhaustion. His fingers, raw and bleeding, soon brushed against something hard and cold. Wool. He clawed away the snow and uncovered a body. It was another trapper, a French-Canadian named Dupont he'd exchanged a few words with at the beginning of the season. Dupont was frozen solid, his face a mask of abject terror, his eyes wide and staring at a horror only he had seen. A dusting of snow lay on his open lips. Abel scrambled back, revulsion and a terrifying, animalistic hope warring within him. The whispers were a triumphant hiss, a sibilant poison poured directly into his ear. A gift, Abel hail, a gift to end the hunger, waste not the forest's bounty. The voice used his full name. It was the first time. The sound of it, spoken by that unseen thing, was the most profound violation yet. He was a good man. A God-fearing man. Abel Hale did not do such things. He tried to drag DuPont's body, to give it what passed for a Christian burial in this forsaken place. He pulled at the frozen limbs, but the corpse was an unyielding statue, and he was a frail, weak thing. The ground was iron. The whispers laughed at his pathetic morality. So weak, so sentimental. Lily is hungry, Abel. Is your pride worth more than her life? The logic of it was a serpent, coiling around his resolve. He was no longer thinking of himself, but of her. A father must survive. He told himself he was just protecting the body from scavengers when he dragged it, inch by painful inch, back to the crude lean-to beside his cabin. He was lying. He knew it. The starving animal inside him knew it. That night, the world ended. The cabin, once his fortress, was no protection. The Wendigo's presence was a physical pressure against the walls, a palpable weight of ancient malice. The temperature inside plummeted, and the fire in the hearth dwindled to a few defiant embers, consuming log after log with no discernible heat. The cold was no longer external. It was a creeping ice in his marrow, a spiritual frost crystallizing in his soul. The whispers were his own thoughts now, his own voice of reason twisted into a monstrous parody. It is not murder. The man is dead. It is only meat. It is a resource. It is survival. It is the way of the world. He sat there in the crushing cold dark, his skinning knife in his trembling hand, the frozen form of DuPont, a silent, accusing shape in the lean-to. The whispers offered one final, terrible piece of logic. Your grandfather knew this hunger, Hale. In the winter of Gaia cut time 47. He didn't hesitate. He answered the call. It is in your blood. The words landed with the force of a physical blow. He remembered the dark family story, the hushed tales of his grandfather surviving a brutal winter when all his companions had perished, returning from the wilderness gaunt and changed, with a darkness in his eyes that never left. An ancestral sin, a dormant seed of horror, passed down through the generations, waiting for the perfect, desperate conditions to bloom. He was not being hunted. He was being claimed. He broke. The man that was Abel Hale died in that cabin, and something else, something much older and hungrier, took his place. He moved with a dreamlike purpose, the knife a familiar weight in his hand. The narrative of what followed is not one of gore, but of sound and sensation. The sickening, resistant scrape of the blade against flesh frozen as hard as oak. The primal, gagging revulsion in his throat warring with the overwhelming, desperate command from the beast in his belly. The first bite was not the relief of sating hunger. It was a sacrament. A jolt of black, unholy energy coursed through him, a burning fire that had nothing to do with warmth. It was a chilling, ecstatic power that pushed out the physical cold and replaced the gnawing emptiness in his stomach with a far deeper, more profound void in his soul. He had not filled a hole, he had carved open an abyss. He looked up from his gruesome sacrament, his eyes drawn to the cabin's single window. Pressed against the frost-caked glass, inches from his own face, was the Wendigo. It was not roaring or threatening. It was watching. Its eyes were sunken pits of shadow, but within them burned a cold, ancient starlight. Its gray, lipless mouth was stretched wide in a silent, knowing, congratulatory grin. In that moment of shared, horrific communion, Abel understood. The Wendigo was not an external monster. It was a state of being, a potential that slumbered in the heart of man. It was a promise, and he had just accepted its terms. He was not looking at his hunter. He was looking in a mirror at what he was now becoming. The blizzard broke with the dawn. The sun, a pale, forgotten stranger, spilled its weak light onto a pristine and silent world. But its warmth did not touch Abel Hale. He stumbled from the cabin, leaving the desecrated remains and the ghost of his own humanity behind. The hunger remained. It was the only thing that remained. But it had changed. It was no longer the simple, honest craving of an empty stomach. It was an eternal, insatiable, spiritual craving for something that could never be filled. It was a constant, gnawing emptiness that demanded to be fed. From a distance, one might have seen a figure moving through the snow-laden trees. It moved with an unnaturally long, loping stride, its limbs seeming to stretch and flow. It was taller than a man should be, and thinner, casting a long, sharp shadow across the endless white. It moved with a silent purpose, heading deeper into the heart of the great empty woods, a new ghost for the ancient forest, a new verse in a very old and terrible song. The wind picked up, rustling the snow from the pines, and for the first time, it carried a new sound. It was not a name. It was a low, guttural whisper that was the only truth left in the world. Hunger. The archives are now closed for the night. For more files unsealed from the shadows of American history, subscribe to the Folklore Archives. Your next case file is just one click away.